Hello again. You are listening to the fifth and final lecture in Part 3 of my multi-part lecture series on the foundations of bioethics. Part 3 has focused on the emergence of bioethics as a discipline and on principlism as the dominant ethical framework within bioethics. In the previous lectures, we examined the historical birth of bioethics, the influence of the philosophers and theologians on the Belmont Report, the development of principlism, and the Belmont Principles as a guiding approach to ethical analysis, and we completed a critical analysis and critique of principlism. In this final lecture, we will conclude our series on the foundations of bioethics by discussing some procedural offsets to the primacy of autonomy in bioethics, as well as considering how we go from a list of non-normative ethical theories to responding to real-life bioethical dilemmas, which will be our focus of the next lecture series. Following this lecture, you should be able to discuss the critique of autonomy, identify two positive aspects and two potential problems with Callahan's principles, with theonomy, and with participated theonomy. And you should be able to describe how to respond to the fact that no ethical theory is truly normative and free from ambiguity or critique. In earlier lectures, I cautioned against relying exclusively on principlism when analyzing ethical dilemmas in healthcare, particularly when the reliance results in an overemphasis of patient autonomy. When autonomy is treated as the primary determinant of what is ethically right or wrong, bioethical analysis risks becoming impoverished as broader moral considerations such as beneficence, justice, professional duty, and the common good become minimized. This narrow focus can also limit or effectively disallow conscientious objection, prioritizing the autonomy of patients while diminishing the moral agency of healthcare professionals. Finally, an over-reliance on autonomy can lead to the overriding of professional judgment, where clinical expertise and ethical responsibility are subordinated to patient preference, even in cases where those preferences may result in harm. Each of these concerns raises important questions about how autonomy should function within ethical decision-making in healthcare. As critiques of principlism and autonomy have intensified, bioethicists have sought ways to reorient ethical reasoning beyond individual choice alone and have proposed alternative frameworks intended to rebalance ethical analysis in healthcare. These approaches seek to situate autonomy within the broader moral and social context, as well as extend the scope of ethical analysis in healthcare. Daniel Callahan, a philosopher, was considered a pioneer of bioethics and one of the world's preeminent bioethics scholars. In 1969, along with his colleague Willard Galen, Callahan established the world's first bioethics research institute, the Hastings Center. His 1973 essay, Bioethics as a Discipline, helped establish bioethics as a legitimate academic discipline. Callahan was a well-known critic of the supremacy of autonomy and argued that given its cultural power, every benefit of every doubt had been given to autonomy as a matter of working public policy. In other words, the more considerations of autonomy are what is driving public policy, the less consideration is going to be given to the common good. Callahan warned that autonomy and liberty, if taken to an extreme, have the potential to thwart the promotion of public health. Thus, Callahan offered two potential secular offsets to autonomy, both of which are utilitarian in nature: the ecological principle and the vital institution principle. The first of Callahan's autonomy-limiting principles is the ecological principle. According to the ecological principle, autonomy could be overridden by consideration of the common good or social interests. The ecological principle addressed two types of harm, incremental and symbolic. Incremental harms are acts that, when taken individually, cause little or no harm, but could have a dramatic adverse effect when taken together. Incremental harms are harms where the benefit of one occurrence of the act may outweigh the risk for a given situation, but if accepted more broadly, the dangers and risks of the harm far outweigh benefits to society. A common example of incremental harms is running a stop sign. If one person runs a stop sign one time, possibly to get their wife, who is in active labor, to the hospital quicker, the benefits may outweigh the risk, especially if the driver can see that no one is driving in the opposite direction. However, if everyone ran stop signs all the time, the risks would gravely outweigh the benefits. Symbolic harms, which have also been called intangible harms, represent activities that are considered wrong not because of the tangible danger to individuals or society, but because the harm violates an important value or principle. An example of a symbolic harm would be finding a pharmaceutical cure for breast cancer, but selling the pharmaceutical at an extremely high price, knowing the demand is there and people would be willing to pay the price to receive the treatment. The price itself creates no new danger. However, it violates principles such as justice and access to care. Additionally, making money, according to Callahan, should not be as morally important as saving lives. According to Callahan's ecological principle, autonomy should be disallowed until after a thorough canvassing to determine both the incremental and symbolic harms. The second of Callahan's autonomy limiting principles is the vital institution. The second of Callahan's autonomy limiting principles is the vital institution principle. According to the vital institution principle, autonomy and individual liberty should be restricted when they threaten vital social interests and institutions. In other words, autonomy should yield to social benefit. Like all ethical theories and principles, Callahan's principles are not without limitations. Defenders of autonomy and critics of Callahan don't deny that autonomy must sometimes yield to social benefit. However, they do raise the crucial question of when must autonomy give way? A common concern with Callahan's ecological principle is that it permits unspecified aggregate impact to suppress individual autonomy. Critics question how society will know when the feared harm actually threatens and thus justifies restrictions of liberty and autonomy. With regard to the vital institution principle, critics worry about epistemic difficulties, noting that virtually every medical and technological innovation has been greeted with predictions of doom and claims that it will change society for the worst. The general consensus from supporters of autonomy is that Callahan's definition of the common good and the aggregate social impact are just too vague to be applied in ethics. For Callahan, the limiting authority on autonomy was strictly secular, and the offsetting principle was the collective effect that individual choice had on society and its institutions. For many others, the limiting authority on autonomy is God, and the offsetting principle is divine will. The Christian Reconstructionists believe that biblical or divine law should rule all spheres of public and private life. They rejected the claim that natural law could be an ethical standard, regarding it as imperfect human reason. In contrast, they argued that the revelation of Scripture is infallible. The offset to autonomy that the Christian Reconstructionists offer is the theonomy principle. Theonomy, which translated literally means God's law, is the view that the Bible contains God's plan for personal and social ethics. This is in opposition to autonomy, where the self provides the basics of ethics. The primary limitations of the theonomy principle is that theonomy raises problems of internal logic of any plan to impose God's law on society and its institutions. If, after all, the imperfect human mind can't be trusted to properly interpret natural law, why then can it be trusted to interpret biblical law? And why take one authority's interpretation over another's? Furthermore, the Bible is silent on many modern bioethical dilemmas, such as cloning, in vitro fertilization, and assisted death, amongst others. Additionally, most Bible-based religions claim universal validity, but they can't all be right, as they variably contradict each other in important ways. In response to these limitations, Catholicism proposed the participated theonomy principle. Participated theonomy makes use of religious natural law and the truths evident within nature that are meant to help us choose rightly. According to participated theonomy, human beings are by nature free and self-determining, but also have a relational character. Therefore, a right understanding of meaning and value must consider both the autonomous individual and the relational individual. Consider the individual who is self-determining and at the same time stands in relation with others with whom he shares a divine kinship. Thus, we are free only to the extent that we turn toward and give ourselves to others, making the truly free person one who does what is good out of love for goodness itself. Under participated theonomy, autonomy is the freedom to love God and do as he wills, mediated through religious teachings. Critics argue that participated theonomy is really a form of self-alienation and asks, what kind of freedom does participated theonomy actually leave humans with? The freedom to do as the church says God wills or suffer eternal damnation? Furthermore, critics warn that this entire principle is based on the supposed existence of a God with a supposed plan for his creation. Critics warn that participated theonomy is simply a way to avoid freedom and avoid responsibility. So now what? The quintessential question, now what? I've gone over a plethora of ethical theories with you. I've discussed with you the limitations of all of the ethical theories we discussed. I provided you with the quintessential ethical theory of bioethics and then spent an entire lecture tearing apart that theory. At this point, you may have a more complex set of questions about ethical theories than you started the course with. When you started the course, you may have had a very limited or minimal understanding of ethics. And now, not only are you trying to wrap your head around ethics, but I've given you a list of theories that none of which can stand on their own. And we are getting ready and preparing to apply our knowledge to actual circumstances. How are you ever going to do that when there is no theory that is universally applicable? There is no ethical system that was free from questions or potential problems. Now what? What you now are tasked with is finding the nugget of truth in the theories, finding and pulling out what bits and pieces of each theory make sense to you, the bits and pieces that align with your worldview and your personal ethical framework. Do not fall into the trap of disregarding the other ethical theories and relying on principlism solely to respond to ethical dilemmas in healthcare. At this point, what you need to do is review the ethical theories, including principlism, identify the nuggets of truth, and identify the gaps and the holes as you develop your own framework. You're going to find that once you do that, you have more answers than you thought you did. And this brings us to the end of our lecture series on the foundations of bioethics. Over the course of this series, we have examined a wide range of ethical theories, along with their limitations. We explored the foundational ethical framework of bioethics and then devoted an entire lecture to critically challenging it. If you find yourself leaving this series with more questions about ethics than when you began, that is not a failure. It is the point. Now, not only are you grappling with ethical reasoning itself, but you have been introduced to multiple theories, none of which can stand entirely on their own. As we prepare to apply these concepts to real-world healthcare dilemmas, this may feel unsettling. How are you supposed to proceed when no theory is universally applicable and no ethical system is free from ambiguity or critique? Your task is not to choose a single theory and discard the rest. Do not fall into the trap of relying on principlism alone as your default response to ethical dilemmas in healthcare. Instead, identify the nuggets of truth within each theory. Pull out the elements that resonate with your worldview and contribute meaningfully to your personal ethical framework. As you begin to construct and develop your ethical framework, you may discover that you have more clarity and more answers than you initially thought.